Thank you very much, and it is lovely to be back here, even though all the technology seemed to be conspiring against my actually getting here. So thank you, Mark, for sticking with it. And actually, I will go off topic for a second, just because as we've been mentioning Thailand, I don't know if everyone in here has heard, but the news has come through that the King of Thailand has died. And speaking as someone who lived in Thailand for 5 years, and I was actually for 2 years technically a Thai civil servant working in the National Commission of Women's Affairs, I'm really thinking of the people of Thailand today. I know I was actually there when the King's mother died, and in that period, civil servants, of which I was one, wore mourning for a year, and indeed they voluntarily then decided to wear mourning for another year in my office. So it's going to be a huge shock to the people of Thailand. And also, of course, many people will know that Thailand's been suffering a great deal of political instability, and this is going to be a very dangerous time for Thailand. So I think we've got to think really of all the people of Thailand and wish everyone the best for a peaceful and democratic outcome to the current situation. Okay, so I'm now going to come closer to home, and what I'm talking about today focuses primarily on the British education system, but I think the arguments within it will apply to whatever part of the world you're from, will apply to your education systems too, because I think we've got sort of two great currents happening in education thought at the moment. We have countries like Singapore, for example, who are recognising that whilst they do very well in some tests and things like maths and science, the actual education they're giving their young people isn't equipping them for life. And so they're looking around saying, how can we get a more creative education, something that allows people to unlock their potential, not to learn stuff by rote and be able to regurgitate it, but to actually think new thoughts, say new things, create a different kind of world, be there for the sort of industries that are so important these days in terms of things like, we mightn't all be quite of the right generation, but computer games are a big creative industry now, and they're a big economic factor, and we need to make sure we're creative, people can get into those sorts of things. And then, of course, there's the other tendency, which is known as the germ tendency, which is basically going backwards in many countries like Britain, heading in the direction of, we've got to have more rote learning. Latin is a wonderful subject, but quite why we have to regard Latin as a foundation, I'm not quite sure. And very often people have been influenced, policymakers have been influenced by their own experiences, their own backgrounds, whereas what we should actually be doing is looking at the evidence. And then, of course, there's a whole lot of other chaos that's going on in the British education system at the moment. We've got students who are facing leaving university with £50,000 more or more worth of debt. Now, actually, on the government's own figures, and this is before some recent changes that will make it even worse, 72% of students will never pay back their loan in full. Now, people from the government will tell you, it's all right, the loan gets written off after 30 years. Except what we've got, of course, is students who are young people, and then older people, who are going through 30 years of their life, for most people from their mid-20s to their mid-50s, with that weight of debt on their shoulder, knowing that they're never going to pay it off, which is, of course, deeply dispiriting. While also, these are, of course, the years when you might normally think about settling down. Maybe if you don't live in London, think about buying a house, having children, and you've got that weight of debt making an impact. And also, of course, this really is a whole policy of fiction, because again, on the government's own figures, 50% of the debt will never be paid off. So our universities are currently funding by a debt system that's actually not going to be paid off. So how does all that add up in the long run? It simply doesn't. And now what we've got also is huge numbers of teachers in our schools. A recent NUJ, National Union of Journalists survey, showed that 50% of our teachers are thinking of leaving the profession. Half of teachers, and that's the full range from people in their 50s to people who qualified last year, half of them are thinking of leaving the profession, in large part because they feel like they're under so much pressure to deliver data, to keep records, to have a huge sort of spreadsheet for every pupil. And as a consequence of that, what they're left with is no time to actually teach, or alternatively, no time to have a life. One way or the other, something's got to give. And then we've also got, you may have heard about the Academy Schools program, which is basically taking schools out of local authority control. And this whole thing, academies and free schools, was built on the idea of, you have a brilliant inspirational head who's going to lead the whole school and everything depends on this one person. Now, I think both philosophically and practically that's an incredibly bad idea. It's profoundly undemocratic. It puts an awful lot of pressure on one person, and when it goes wrong, boy, does it go horribly wrong. And we've seen just this week another report of a school disappearing into a whole welter of mismanagement at best, possibly fraud, millions of pounds disappearing from one school's budget. So this is really not working very well. And then I think if there's one figure that really sums up how much British schools are failing our pupils, it's the fact that the rate of depression among the under 16s has doubled in the past decade. And there was recently a survey out that specifically focused on girls that said 1 in 4 girl children in British schools in the teen years is suffering from some form of mental ill health. 1 in 4. And that's horrific figures. And so I have to say, really, as a 50-year-old, when I talk to our young people, and I speak a lot at schools, universities and colleges, I say, I have to say from behalf of my generation to yours, I'm sorry, we've made a right mess of things. And one of the things that might be of particular interest to many people in this room is that we also have a university sector that's expanding at a great rate. I've been spending a lot of time in Sheffield recently, and as in many of our other northern and Midland cities, you see universities are a very large and dominant part of the town, new buildings, shiny, big new buildings, showing great confidence. But a lot of that is built on the money of foreign students who of course pay massively higher fees than do home students. Except Theresa May says she wants to cut the number of foreign students in Britain. Now, how the education policy and the immigration policy are fitting together here is not very clear. And of course, this becomes particularly ridiculous. It's a word I'm using a lot about government policy at the moment. Becomes particularly ridiculous when you think about the fact that behind this policy of cutting the number of foreign students is a promise, a long made ago promise to reduce immigration to Britain to tens of thousands. Except you ask any expert, any demographer, and they'll tell you that students are not immigrants. They are people who come here to study, they consume, they bring their money from other parts of the world, leave it here, and the majority of them go away again. So they should not be counted in the immigration figures. Yeah, and the other point I'd make also about the whole issue of the immigration cap is the figure that's being measured here is the net figure. So it's number of people coming in versus number of people going out. Now, the number going out, that's something the government hasn't yet tried to control. The way Theresa May's going with authoritarianism, we might see that happening soon, but the government isn't standing there shoving some more people out the door. So the net figure is something that the government innately has no control over because Britons might decide to leave the country for all kinds of different reasons. I mean, sadly, I've just been down in Whitney where there's the by-election for David Cameron's seat going on. Well, one of the things that I encountered was 2 people on the street there who told me that basically they were so depressed by the Brexit result, by the vote to leave the EU, they both independently decided to leave Britain and go and live somewhere else. And that's something that we're seeing, a lot of younger people are thinking about doing. And that's very sad, and that's a real loss to Britain. But again, even Theresa May, I don't think is going to be able to try and control that one. So that's the kind of state of education today. And I haven't even started on the very odd way in which Theresa May suddenly dreamed up a policy of new grammar schools. And this came after it's been generally acknowledged that grammar schools are bad in terms of increasing inequality, are bad for the overall quality of education, are an all-round bad idea. And, I'm saying this, but it could equally be quite a large number of Tory MPs who've also been saying this. But I always try to focus on hope. So one of the things that I want to offer you as a sliver of hope is the fact that things cannot continue as they are. The one thing that's certain is the status quo is profoundly unstable. It is going to change because there's no way we can continue as we are. But perhaps a more concrete hope and a more inspiring one is the nature of the young people who I meet as I go about my job as a Green Party politician. And the young people that I meet, just one example, being a very classic resident of London, I've never been on the London Eye, that big Ferris wheel on the Thames beside the Houses of Parliament, until this week. And it was actually the Women of the World Festival for the International Day of the Girl Child. They had a mentoring scheme where I got to go in a pod with some young women and talk about their future with them on the London Eye. So, it took that, having lived in London for 17 years, it was that made me end up going on the London Eye. But what I found was a wonderful group of young women, a really inspiring group of young women who have really quite an amazing grasp of the state of the world they're coming out into. They're really aware of environmental issues, really aware of social issues and inequality, really aware of Britain's broken political system. And more than that, they feel a real responsibility to fix it. One of the things I find is I think the young people of about 14 years of age today are actually going to be in a really amazing generation, I think, because they don't actually even remember the financial crash. I was talking to some young Green members of 14 and 15, and I was saying to them, oh, remember when UK Uncut was occupying Vodafone stores to demand they paid their taxes? And I thought, no, you don't. You're too young. That was 2011. But they don't even remember the financial crash. They really only remember the last few years when it's really been recognised that the global economic system is broken and that we can't just repair it with a few plasters, a few patches here and there, that there's going to have to be fundamental change. And a lot of them, the best of them, really do feel like it's their job to fix it. Now, we've got a real responsibility, us meaning the older people, and everyone in this room in this context is the older people, whatever your age, to help them, support them, encourage them, and make them feel like they're not on their own. Because one of the real challenges of this is the risk that these young people can just feel so much weight of responsibility that they simply fall apart under that amazing pressure. So we really need to really focus on helping them, supporting them, and helping them gain the skills, the knowledge that they need. Which is where I get to what the main topic of my talk today is, something that I want to focus on particularly, which is education in artistic and cultural subjects. So I started by saying how we've got Singapore saying we don't necessarily want to fall down on that, but we want a much more creative, and countries like Britain racing in the Singapore direction, going past Singapore. Well, what we've got in Britain is successively governments who've downgraded and disrespected education in artistic, creative subjects. I mean, things like drama, things like art, music, even technical subjects like carpentry, subjects, the technical skills that can allow you to make things you do with your hands. And that's I'm going to argue, the case I'm going to present today, deeply damaging and destructive. Now, I will admit that one of the problems with education is that everyone, in some way or another, has been educated. So everyone has their own personal view formed by their own experience. And one of the things that I've often said is, when I was about 11 or so, I was really fascinated by lungfish, which are this amazing species of fish that are really like early amphibians. They're a very ancient species. And when fish first started to come out of the oceans and breathe, and out of the rivers and breathe fresh air, so they were kind of bridge species. Now, I'm really fascinated by lungfish, but I promise that if I'm ever Education Secretary, I will not make everybody learn about lungfish. Unlike some examples recently from Michael Gove. However, I think one of the things that I learned as a student that I think has broader application and that there's evidence to back is that studying art, as I did for the equivalents of GCSEs in Australia, was actually one of the most valuable subjects that I ever studied. Now, I did physics, I did maths, rather badly, I have to confess. I did history and English, and all those were valuable. But actually, I had to fight quite hard as about a 12-year-old to do art as a subject for GCSEs. There was a general perception that this wasn't something that academic pupils did. And I suspect, remembering myself as a 12-year-old, part of the reason why I insisted on doing it was I was a slightly contrary 12-year-old, and I wanted to do not what was expected of me. But actually I found, when I first came to Europe as an Australian backpacker in my early 20s, art was a subject that I kept going back to again and again. When I visited museums and galleries, when I visited historic houses, I had some context, some understanding of what I was looking at that helped me to start to understand, to learn a whole lot more. It was one of the most valuable subjects. In fact, I'd rank it with geography. I'd say those were the two most valuable subjects I ever studied at school. Geography taught me both how to read a topographic map and also taught me where you can find different kinds of shops in different kind of places. And those rules I've applied across 3 continents, and they always work. But art was really valuable. And I think that's a broader argument there. Having learnt something about a creative subject enriches the whole of your life. It's an introduction, a start of a genuinely rich life. And everybody should have access to that. We want everyone to engage in that. However, I know that there's some commentators who are simply just not going to be able to understand that, to engage with that. So I'm going to turn round to the economists and make the arguments in their terms. The cultural industries are an important part of our economy. A critical part, whether it's period dramas, and I came back from the southwest of England this morning, and some of you might have heard of the BBC series Poldark, which is a historical drama, which is also famous for a certain degree of topless display of chest muscles. And the local papers were terribly excited about sneak preview photos from the latest series. To the sort of other end of the arts, new artistic movements, computer games that I've already referred to, or craft productions of things that anyone can buy and have in their home and enrich their lives. Now, I'm talking to economists in their own terms here. So let's be blunt. Artistic industries are worth £84.1 billion a year to the British economy. Those are 2014 figures. And in 2014, that was growing at 9% a year, which I can tell you is a lot faster than the general British economy is growing overall. And looking at this for a second from the environmental perspective, one of the good things about growth in the artistic and cultural sector is that it's broadly pretty low carbon, most of it, low environmental impact. Because actually, what you're paying for, what's generating the money, is not so much the actual goods, the materials, but the creative endeavour that's gone into them. Again, you think of computer games, you think of movies and TV shows. Sure, you use a little bit of electricity to consume them, but broadly speaking, they're pretty low impact on the world. The kind of things that enrich our lives without trashing the planet. And yet we've got a government that's actively discouraging the study of all of these subjects, not just with disregarding them by being dismissive of them, but also by introducing something that's called the EBAC, which requires our GCSE students, so that's students at about 16, many of whom will then go on to do A-levels at 18 or so. They have to take English, maths, science, a humanities subject and a foreign language. And they want to have 90% of students doing that. Now, what that means is that huge numbers of schools are dropping out the creative subjects because they're not part of the EBAC that the government is insisting is what's the really important stuff and that you have to do and that you're going to get marked on as a school, you're going to get judged on as a school. So there's a group called Back for the Future is campaigning against the English Baccalaureate, as it's so called, and they're highlighting that last year, just 1 year, creative, artistic and technical GCSEs fell by nearly 8%. Year on year, many fewer pupils studying. 10% drop in the performing arts, 5% drop in drama. And teachers are saying that's a figure that's just going to accelerate as this change moves right through the year groups. Now, it's not often that I declare that I actually agree with former ministers of the Thatcher government. You might regard this as an historic moment, really. But I agree with Kenneth Baker, who was one of Margaret Thatcher's education secretaries. because he called for a new baccalaureate that would include at least one creative and one artistic subject. Now, I wouldn't necessarily agree with the exact detail of how he structured it, but it's certainly better than what we've got now. It means we're potentially enriching everybody's life, all of our future generations. And there's a couple more points I want to make about creative education. One is that it's really important to health and well-being. I was actually really alerted to this whole issue and got really deeply engaged in this whole issue with some pupils at a school at a place called Bury outside Manchester. And they were GCSE performing arts students, the last in their school who was going to do that because the school was discontinuing the subject. Wow. And they actually performed some of their exam work for me. Now, I will admit that, sometimes when one's asked to attend creative performances by pupils, you sit there and quite, prepared to clap politely and say, oh, that was really good. But I really, really meant it. It was really, really good. It was of a standard that had I seen it at a university, I would have said, this is a really good performance, there's really fine creative work going on here. And I think one of the reasons for that was the whole subject was how angry they were about the discontinuation of their subject. And they were really speaking from the heart as young people. And it wasn't actually going to affect them, but they were thinking of their younger brothers and sisters, their classmates coming behind them, who were going to miss out on what they'd enjoyed. And one of the things they were highlighting was that how for many of them, young people, the sort of challenges I was talking about earlier, it had been really important for their health and well-being to be able to use art, creativity, performance to express what they were thinking, what they were feeling, how to get through the experiences of their life, come out the other side in a positive kind of way. And I mean, that means, facing the reality of the world, facing the reality of their own lives. And those are emotions that, if you haven't created this space, can well find much more destructive kind of outlets. It's simply healthy. More than that, one final point to make, because I always believe that, dialogue is perhaps more creative than monologue, but I do just want to make one final point, which is that creativity in the broadest sense is vital to all of our futures. The state that our world is in now today cannot continue. We have to find very different ways of doing things, whether that's not, as we are in Britain, consuming the resources, our share of the resources of 3 planets every year when we've only got 1 planet, whether that's the fact we have to find new ways in which we can create an economy that creates jobs that everybody can build a life on, but that people aren't exploited, made ill by, destroyed by. There's so many things that we need to do differently to create a better quality of life for people in Britain, for people around the world. And to do that, you don't need, I think we're all very clear now, economics formulas. Science, maths, physics, all those things are useful and important, but they're not going to tell us how to live differently. What we need are people imagining a different kind of world. Now, one of the things that I often say when I talk to creative audiences is that we have a lot of imagining of disaster. I'm afraid I'm going to be controversial here and say there are far too many zombie movies made. There's an awful lot, and some of them are very good, I've read some of them, an awful lot of apocalypse novels where the world's all fallen apart and people are trying to survive in the midst of everything having gone to hell. But actually what I really want to see is more and more people having creative visions in a positive world, a world in which everything's kind of worked out. We're running on renewable energy, we're living within environmental limits, we're not turning our oceans into a plastic soup anymore. It's all worked out fine. And what I mean by this, I really do want to stress that I'm not particularly talking about political films or political novels or whatever, not explicitly political ones. What I really want to see is a Hollywood rom-com, a romantic comedy. You can fill in your own leads according to taste. A rom-com that's just set against a background of a world in which everything's worked out fine. And it can be the usual story, boy meets boy, boy loses boy, boy gets boy again. That's fine. All the usual structures, but just with that setting in the background. Because what we have to do is offer people hope. And the thesis that I'm presenting to you today is that creative education, creative industries, a creative life are absolutely essential for that kind of hope. Thank you.
Thank you. Some questions?
Yeah, go for it.
Hi, I used to work as a music therapist in a school, and my kids went to very innovative schools where the school is only as good as the head teacher, the length of time the staff are there. If they feel valued and they are allowed to do their work in an innovative, interesting, encouraging way, the pupils themselves will develop the kind of creative interest. Music, for example, art, drama, very important, not just for the sake of the actual activity, but the listening, the sharing, the discipline that goes with it, learning public speaking. If you take, for example, with this particular school, the history staff took a topic and wrote a play on a history subject they had to do at school. And that just developed because it became a play, at which point they then started composing songs as a musical. Then the dance element came in, and then the sets for the play came in, and it was all completely initiated as a group, entire school activity at the end. And what was so wonderful is they did the play at the school for charity, and there was actually a director from the West End there who was so inspired. And of course, that was a very good example of creativeness, but they have to start them from young. And it's not just a money thing, it's about everything else, the confidence, the listening, and everything else that one needs to get the potential of the child.
I very much agree with that, and just to sort of share in reaction to that, I was recently in Birmingham jail, and I will confess it's the first time I've been in a jail, but I was there for an organisation called Debating Matters, which usually arranges debates for schools, but for the first time they'd organised in the jail a debate for the prisoners. So I was actually there for a question time style event with Edwina Curry, among others, and so we debated, and then we listened to the prisoners debate. And one of the things that was both, inspiring, but also kind of disturbing about that, there was one prisoner in particular, but all of the prisoners to some degree. One prisoner in particular, when he first started, the first time he tried, he just kind of dissolved and fell to pieces. But by the end of it, he was possibly the best debater there. And he was clearly, you could see him growing in confidence with almost every word, because someone was listening to him.
Exactly.
And, we're talking about a man, late 20s, early 30s, and maybe no one had ever listened to him before, no one had ever valued what he'd said before. And, it's hypothetical history, but if that person had had the right education at the right point, very likely they would not have been in Birmingham jail. And of course, that's one of the other things I might add into this, the costs of not doing this, the lost opportunities, but also the actual physical costs, like it costs a lot of money to keep a person in jail for a year. That's the costs we're inflicting on the future by failing our children now.
Hello, thank you for your amazing speech. My name is Aygür Memjanov. I'm a PhD student with ICD. I agree with all of your points, and as a foreigner, I actually want to praise British educational system. In my hometown, I did my IGCSEs, which emphasized and gave me a very well-rounded a variety of subjects, including arts. Then I went to do International Baccalaureate program, which is an alternative to A-levels, and that I think was the foundation for my educational experience. As you say, every person's experience is what he thinks about education. So in that sense, and having British international schools in Almaty, and actually several of them, including Haileybury ones, I think it's an honor, and I think it's a great example. So the fact that you stand here and talk about challenges within the British system is just to show there's always, place for progress. But generally, I just wanted to agree with you that I think well-rounded education is the way to go. Yeah. Thank you.
Just to respond to that, it is worth saying, of course, the International Baccalaureate is called that because it's international. It's not like A-levels, and of course, it's much broader. And when I talk about the EBAC that the government's talking about now, it is nothing like they've borrowed the name, but is nothing like IB. So, the direction they're heading in is very much not that direction, and that is very much an international thing, not a British thing. And, I think broadly it's a very good approach in the IB. Yeah.
Can I say something? When you're talking, I just realized the internal aspect of what you were saying. There are two interesting things that in my life. There's one young lady that's, I have no idea why, it's a friend's daughter, has kind of lost it. I mean, we all have mental health issues, but his son suddenly becomes somebody different. And so she came to visit me, and I was saying to her, let's think, what would you like to do? Because she needs to do something, I felt, How about drawing? Like music? I realized that she doesn't have any desire to do anything. I said, can you play any sports, etc., let's do something. I mean, that made me feel, when you're talking, how important it is for emotional intelligence to really have these creative things, even the little things. How to make a little, something from wood.
Knit or crochet, one of the skills that have disappeared a lot. Yeah.
That's one point. The other one is internal desire of someone. My daughter was in every play, in everything, from little girl until she was sixth form college, and she desperately wanted theatre studies. I said, okay, but only one module. Because I was trying controlling her, and I was saying, do English literature. She's great in English, and she writes nicely. So I said, there's so competitive world. You're going to be, you're not going to be able to make it as an actress or something. And so anyway, she listened to me, and at the end, the last 2 years, she didn't do so much theatre studies. But she always wanted to do it. She became top of her career, and she was a creative director for an advertising agency. But she still went. She wanted to go to school and be. That's inside her. That's her desire. It was unrighteous of me to do that, or whatever it is. It was wrong. So therefore, she went to poor school while she's working. Amazing dedication, for which I raise my hand any time, because she went every day at 6 to 9, 6 to 10, whatever it was, and every Saturday of her life for almost 1 year. Then she took 4 months off work and did the thing. Now today, she's in a play, and she critics. I mean, she was in a few other plays, and she goes back to work, etc. But two critics have actually. She just sent me a thingy. This is a review about me with her name mentioned, and I felt amazing. This girl, if you crush that girl, she always wanted. She grew up and she wanted to do it. Yeah. So therefore, why not really give the seeds when they're young, and then when they grow up, they can do anything they want. Yeah. It's very, very important, I feel.
It was one of the things I was saying to the girls doing the mentoring, and I say to young people everywhere, is, there's a lot of pressure at the moment. Young people are told, you should go to the university with the highest graduate salaries, or you should go to this course because, you're guaranteed a job at the end of it. Now, I mean, obviously there are some things like medicine or something that's broadly true of. But in many, many areas at the moment, the world is changing so fast, technology is moving so fast. There is no such thing as a guaranteed job, a guaranteed future. In 10 years, whole industries might have disappeared. So we're profoundly doing our young people a disservice, both for the reasons that you're highlighting, that they're not developing their real potential, their real interests, their real passions, but also because even if they suppress all of that and do what they're told is the right thing, there's no guarantee it's going to work out anyway. So then, imagine how upset, angry, disillusioned you'd be if you've given up your passion and gone and done something boring that you've been told that'll give you a guaranteed career for life. And 10 years later, you're unemployed and there's no future in it. So, it really makes sense to tell people, follow your passion, find your own way forward, because there is no other logical path to follow.
I've got a question, of course. I know, of course, Christian, you are speaking about the education at the moment, but I love Greek. Yeah, I've got lots of friends from Greece, of course, we don't want. However, talk about refugee and UK. Please, talk about what is opinion.
Okay, right. All right, I could go for another hour, but I won't. But, to start off with, to position myself and the Green Party, I'll just refer to Twitter and say that I use the hashtag #RefugeesWelcome a great deal. I think it's an absolute disgrace that Britain, I think the last figures I saw, Britain across the countries across Europe ranked 17th, 17th in the number of refugees accepted per head of population. You look at the contrast, for example, Sweden. Sweden last year accepted 160,000 refugees. Now, Sweden has a population of about 10 million, about a sixth of the population that Britain does. And we accepted figures in the low couple of thousands. It's an absolute disgrace. So there's a whole range of issues we're working on, but starting with some of the topical ones, we've been pushing very hard on saying we should be welcoming what are known as the Dubs children and the Dublin children to Britain. Now, the Dubs children, that refers to Lord Dubs, who was himself actually a kinder transport, was brought to Britain, is now a member of the House of Lords. He was brought to Britain as a child refugee from Hitler. And so he basically pushed through, and in fact Theresa May herself ended up moving it when she was Foreign Secretary, an amendment that said Britain would accept unaccompanied child refugees from around Europe. Mm-hmm. That was, I've lost track, but something like 4 months ago. Nothing's happened. The government indeed just this week told Parliament, yes, we are going to do something. But talking to people I know who are in the Calais refugee camp now, they can see no sign of the British government. Yeah, exactly. And also, so that's the Dubs children. So we're campaigning very hard on Dubs children. There's also what are known for shorthand as the Dublin children. And this is under Dublin 3 regulations that say if someone has a close relative who's been accepted for refugee status in Britain, they should also be able to come to Britain and get refugee status. Now, what's truly horrific is there are children in Calais now who have been identified as eligible for Dublin 3 sanctuary. The government is simply not doing anything. Some of them have actually been identified and acknowledged by the government as Dublin 3 children. And those children are still left on their own in the hell, and I'm sure there's some people here who've been in the Calais camp. Those children are left incredibly vulnerable and at risk in that deeply dangerous situation. And one of the things I think, perhaps talking about the danger to children and indeed adults in Calais, sometimes the fact that that's a dangerous place is used as a stick to beat the refugees themselves with. But actually, one of the things that's really worth saying is there was a very good study done by a university that showed that well over 70% of the children reported being assaulted by either the police or French local residents or apparently local residents of Calais and environs. So those children, the risks to them, obviously there are risks in the camp, but there are also much broader safety risks that come from France, not from the refugees themselves. So that's a couple of top-line things. Sorry, I'll just cover a couple more things really quickly. I mean, the problem is, of course, we're saying we should basically accept the people from Calais. But it doesn't really help if Calais then fills up again. So what we should also be doing is welcoming Britain's fair share of refugees, the white refugees now in Europe. Now, Britain's 12% of the EU population, and I will say regarding your earlier discussion about Brexit, etc., it is worth saying we are still part of the European Union. We haven't left yet. But if we're 12% of the EU population, it would be reasonable to say as a ballpark figure we should be welcoming 12% of the refugees. That's a kind of reasonable starting point. You can argue around the edges, but that's fine. So that's the refugees in Europe. But then, of course, we can't have refugees risking their lives to come across the Med to take all sorts of dangerous routes into Europe. Now, actually, I was only reading the other day, there is a very small church-backed scheme that's flying a few refugees out of camps in places like Jordan and Lebanon, flying them legally into Italy. But it's like, one flight a week of 100 people or something. It's tiny, or entirely voluntary supported. All the money comes from voluntary contributions. So what there needs to be is a whole scheme that says, and it's worth saying, 95% of Syrian refugees are in neighbouring countries. It's those neighbouring countries that are massively carrying the burden. And most of those refugees want to stay in those countries. They're not desiring to come to Europe. But the ones who desire to come to Europe have good reason to come to Europe. There should be an orderly program that brings them safely across the Med, safely into Europe and safely spread them around. So sorry, that's a very long answer, but that's kind of covered the main issues. Okay.
Just a quick one. I just want to say it's a very brilliant and illuminating discussion, absolutely fascinating. I just want to share something about encouraging young children to be multi-talented and to maximize their potentialities. In my granddaughter's school, she's only 5. They're teaching them digital animation, like family learning. We're writing a book right now. She's just 5 years old. And we had to go on River Thames, and we had to put the excursion, the journey into book and so on, and absolutely fascinating. As someone who had been a parent governor, I know that teachers are under a lot of stress. And I agree with you that they spend more time doing paperwork and also filling forms rather than the time they will spend teaching children. And looking back at my own education, it's a shame that they did not emphasize being entrepreneurial skills. It's just something very narrow. Just, this is your profession. You only learn about your profession. So if you need to change that profession, I don't know how to do any business. I was trained as a nurse, as a social worker. That's all. So if I cannot maximize, if I cannot turn it into business, everybody should learn other things like maybe know how to design necklaces or something of interest. So because there's not going to be paid jobs again, so people have to be kind of stand on their feet and be creative and think outside the box. I think they should teach that business and entrepreneurial skills in schools.
I mean, I think just responding to that, there's one phrase which is lifelong learning. And really what we need your early education to do is to prepare you for lifelong learning, to learn how to learn, so that, because as I said, the economy, the state of the world is changing so fast, what you might need to know in 10 years' time might be very different from what you need to know now. So what you really need to know is how to learn, absorb new things. Again, we come back to the creativity of thinking of different things to do. And again, there's another environmental aspect to this too, which is, I used to work with someone who in many ways had a very narrow education. And she was always in personal financial trouble. And she always went shopping every Saturday and Sunday. And I was her boss, so I had to be, a bit careful. One can't interfere in the personal life of one's employees too much, etc., etc. But I did one day, very gently sit her down and say, couldn't she perhaps on Saturday, do something else, go and play sport, go for a walk in the countryside, knit something or, whatever. And she just looked at me like, basically, what would you do if you didn't go shopping? And, it is worth thinking about. We have an economic system that is actually dependent very heavily on people going shopping. If we think about things we need to change, that's one of the things we need to change too. Thank you.